Shalom. Welcome to Lights of the Nations. We're returning now after a brief hiatus to the Rambam, Maimonides, Beit, HaBechira. We have been discussing other things for some weeks now. We've had some specials that have been in tune with the season of the calendar. And then we paused to go a little bit in depth as kind of a tangent, the subject of the depths. We talked about King David. And now, today, we are returning to some practical applications that Maimonides makes regarding the building of the altar. And we may even possibly today manage to conclude the second chapter of Beit HaBechira. We're just about done. We have several entries more to the conclusion of this chapter that dealt, as you know, solely with the altar. You know that in the news lately, it's been mentioned that a group of rabbis known as the nascent Sanhedrin, those that have been busy and occupied with this accomplishment of attempting for the sake of all of Israel and the world to reinstate the authority of this supreme body, the Sanhedrin. It was reported in the news that there are plans to purchase a flock of sheep in preparation for the Passover sacrifice. This involves all sorts of technical details and study and practice. And this single announcement that made headlines, it's been discussed far and wide, the intention of this group of rabbis to purchase a flock of sheep for the purpose of preparation for the Passover offering. This has caused a great deal of controversy, and people have been discussing it. How could this be? Is it possible? Are they crazy? What is this? What could this mean? And it has elicited all sorts of responses and reactions. And the fact is, it's interesting when we think about these reactions in the world that we live in today, a world which has basically become centered around immediate self-gratification, complacency, and a certain type of lifestyle which really doesn't take into consideration universality and our place as part of a greater whole. And recently I had an experience where I was actually giving a presentation to a group of school children, older kids though, regarding the whole concept of the offerings in the temple. And the reaction that I received was one of mixed bewilderment and kind of a certain disdain and even repugnancy, but it was coming from a position of an assumed higher morality. And of course, the funny thing is that people don't seem to have a problem with the concept of slaughtering animals and the consumption of animals that are slaughtered by the millions in this world every day, when it comes to the satisfaction, the gratification of our own desires. But when it comes to this concept that perhaps God has a greater plan for all of the universe, that there are strata of creation, that there is man who needs to be dealt with in a way that allows him to discern between his animal nature and his higher godly nature, when we think about the fact that there is a divine orchestration here and that there are commandments that God in his compassion has given us to draw closer to him, as in fact is the root of the word korban, offering, as we've discussed, we see that there is a certain gap here between the conception that people have and with which they regard their own needs and the thought that perhaps there is a higher purpose to all of creation, and how far it is that we've fallen from a real true understanding and identification with these things, which of course is readily understandable considering how much has transpired in the world and how far we are from the time of the temple. But this idea of this being newsworthy, an item to be reported that there is a group of people who are ostensibly responsible, sane people, even leaders, that are considering the reinstatement of something biblical on the level of the offering of the Passover, which in fact is a very serious, eternal biblical obligation upon all of Israel, the repercussions of which to not bring it are extremely serious. It's just very interesting to see how people react. And actually, as we draw to a conclusion, perhaps in this lesson, perhaps in our next lesson, the chapter in Maimonides' timeless work regarding the building of the altar, we bear in mind that the whole purpose of Maimonides bothering to codify these details and to cull all of the sources from the Talmud and all of the repositories of Jewish tradition is because of the fact that this mitzvah, this commandment, has never left us, its significance has never waned, and the intention of our study, as well as the intention of the Rambam, in the first place, at recording it, is for us to be ready, to be prepared, to be knowledgeable, to be concerned about our duty, our obligation, and the restoration of what God considers to be our relationship with Him based on our striving to bring Him honor and to understand ourselves as people in this world as well. So, if we are to bring the Passover sacrifice, we need an altar. And as we learned together early on, the altar has to be built in a very specific place, one place on earth, and its place cannot be moved even by a fraction because of the significance of that particular spot. So too, how the altar is to be built is extremely significant. And if indeed we are going to be bringing a Passover sacrifice in the near future, we certainly will have a very good place to look to see exactly how to go about building that altar. So, in the second chapter of Hilchot Beit HaBechira, we are up to halacha number 13. And here, Maimonides explains to us some details pertaining to the ramp, the kevesh, leading up to the altar. That was originally discussed in the first chapter, in halacha number 17. And here, in this particular halacha, number 13 of chapter 2, Maimonides is going to share with us the measurements of the ramp and its construction. And so we read, V'kevesh haya banui lidromo shel mizbeach. A ramp was built on the south side of the altar. Arako 32 amma al rochav 16 amma. Its length was 32 amma, and its width was 16 amma. V'haya ochel ba'aretz 30 amma mitzad hamizbech. And actually, when we say that its length was 32 amma, this refers to the slant of its entire structure, but on the ground it actually measured 30 amma. Uporeach mimena amma al yisod ve'amma al hasovev. And when we look at this illustration of the altar, we understand this is a very unusual concept, that in the place where the ramp goes over the place of the yisod, as well as when it covers over the sovev, there is a hollow space. It's as if that section of the kevesh, of the ramp, is actually floating, as it were, in midair. There is a space of an amma which is empty, hovering over the place of the yisod, and another space of the amma which is hovering over the place of the sovev. So let's discuss this in detail. First of all, the very concept that the ramp is found on the southern side of the altar is derived from the Talmud, from biblical verses, and we will find also that these particular attributes of the size of the ramp are discussed by the Mishnah. The concept of the space, the empty space as it were, in the ramp above the place of the yisod and above the place of the sovev is also derived in Tractate Zvachim. And Maimonides continues and tells us, Ve'avir me'at haya mafsik ben hakevesh lamizbeach. There was a small space. It isn't necessarily a space that even has to be measured, but there was a space between the ramp and the altar itself. In other words, the significance, the emphasis is that the ramp and the altar were two separate structures. The ramp was not attached to the altar, to the extent that there actually was a visible small space, a crack, between the top of the altar and the ramp itself. And in fact, this could also be seen all down the side of the ramp as well, in addition to that space of an amah above the sod and above the sovev. So they were actually two separate structures. What is the reason for the space between the ramp and the altar? This is an interesting example of a derivation that the rabbis make in the Talmud. They actually derive this concept from a verse, and the verse is found in Deuteronomy chapter 12, and the verse tells us, Va'asita olotecha habasar v'hadam. The verse, as we see, is a description of how the burnt offering is to be conducted, and the verse mentions together the meat and the blood of the burnt offering. Our rabbis derive that there is a halachic principle which is being alluded to in this verse. And that principle is that just as the blood of the offering is to be tossed against the side of the altar, so too the various parts of the korbanot, the offerings that are to be brought to the altar, are not to be placed on the top of the altar, but actually to be tossed into the fire. Thus, the space at the top of the altar necessitates the Kohanim to stand back a certain extent to be able to toss the parts of the offerings that are to be placed onto the fire on the roof of the altar from a bit of a distance, so they'll be able to literally do it with zrika, by throwing it from the top of the ramp to the top of the altar. This is actually an example of a principle of Talmudical exegesis from which we can appreciate the fact, as we have emphasized on many occasions, and as I know that many of our viewers have learned, there is a tremendous amount of dimension, of detail, a wealth of information that the great sages of Israel have privy to, have access to, that was handed down in uninterrupted tradition from the Sinai revelation, from the time that Moses was on Mount Sinai, and a portion of which as well is derived according to principles that were given by the Almighty to Moses, so that the Torah itself can be seen as actually almost like a shorthand, like a diary, in a way, like a code that has to be broken. I have said this before, and I'll say it again. I don't know how it's possible to study the Torah in English without access to the original Hebrew, and I don't know how it's possible to study the Torah without access to the oral tradition, because a total window is a totally new perspective, a new window is opened up when we can access the riches, the traditions, the inner knowledge, not the secret knowledge, but the inner knowledge of our sages who received this information in an uninterrupted tradition ever since Sinai. The great wisdom of the Creator himself decreed that the written Torah is to be accompanied by the oral Torah, hand in hand in every generation. Thus we come to a verse like this one, which we described in Deuteronomy 12, which seems rather an open and shut case. And it does mention these two words, the basar and the dam, in the same verse describing the olah, the burnt offering. But our sages, with their keen insights, understanding that every single word has a deeper meaning, and that even the juxtaposition within a verse between words is to teach us literally piles and piles, as the expression is in the Talmud relating to Rabbi Akiva, piles and piles of halachot. We see that nothing goes for naught, and that there's actually a requirement which, according to the understanding that we are sharing now comes from Sinai. If there is a requirement for the limbs of the offering, which are to be placed in the fire on the altar, if there's a requirement for them not to be physically placed there, but to actually be lightly tossed from the top of the ramp, this necessitating a slight space between the ramp and the altar so that one would have to step back a bit further, a Kohen, in order to guarantee that he will need to have the opportunity to toss it. This is actually seen in the verse by our sages because they received this instruction, this tradition from the Sinai revelation, and that means for us, in all practical sense, for practical purpose, that this is a detail of the requirements of the Word of God. And this, again, is just such a good opportunity to reflect on this, because many times people who are not coming from a Jewish tradition, that are first exposed to Jewish concepts and to a Jewish perspective of Torah study, they come to this type of information and they perceive that there are many, many details and laws governing over a complex subject like life in the time of the temple and what was going on in the temple. And there is a terribly gross misconception that many people have regarding something like this, and they'll say, these laws are man-made. They'll say, how do you know that the altar, that its ramp rose up from the southern side? I see that in no verse. They'll say, how do you know that God requires that the parts of the offering that are to be burnt are to be tossed? And they'll also say, how do you even know that there was a space like this over the Yisod? How do you know there was a Yisod? There was a space over the Sovev. How do you know that they were two separate structures? If all of these things are not things that we see specifically in the verses, this is the key to understanding the true dimension of Torah wisdom and knowledge, is that it is virtually impossible to navigate the sea of Torah without a ship in the sea of the Talmud, which is in fact an elaboration, an exploration, an illumination of God's requirements. So that the furthest thing that we can say from the truth would be that these are man-made details. These are details that are given over, that were channeled, as it were, that are exposited by our great sages, but it actually comes from the exact same revelation and source that gave us the verses of the Torah itself. And Maimonides concludes this halakha, number 13, by telling us that the height of the kevish, v'gova hakevish, tesha amot pachot shtut ad keneged hamaracha, that the height of the ramp measured 1 tefach less than 9 amot, and stood opposite the top of the altar. So, this is a brief description of the main structure of the ramp. As we continue in halakha Yud Daled, in halakha number 14, Maimonides tells us another very interesting detail regarding the ramp. Ushnei vashim ktanim yotzim mimenu shabahem ponim la'yisod v'lasovev umuvdalin min hamizbeach kim lo nima, that part of the body, of the main structure of the ramp of the altar, is that 2 mini ramps, 2, as it were, access ramps, kind of side roads, as it were, protruded from the ramp itself, and these smaller mini ramps against the side of the ramp itself gave access for the Kohanim to the Yisod, the foundation of the altar, and to the Sovev, which you will recall is a narrow path all along the approximate middle of the altar. And Maimonides explains to us the positioning of these smaller ramps. One is actually on the east side, and one is on the west side. What was the purpose of these smaller ramps? The small ramp is called the Kevesh HaKatan. The smaller ramp on the west side is the one which reaches the Yesod. And actually, that ramp, that reaches the Sovev, and that ramp facilitated the Kohen's descent from the Sovev. We recall that the blood, for example, of the chatat, of the sin offering, must be dashed against the top half of the altar. So this required the Kohen to actually be on the Sovev, in the middle of the altar, and the smaller ramp on the western side gave the ability of the Kohen to descend from the Sovev. The smaller ramp on the western side also reached the Yesod, so that the Kohen would actually be able to descend to the Yesod, to that place where the Shitin were found, the smaller holes against the side of the foundation, where the remnants of the blood of certain offerings had to be poured, whereas the smaller ramp on the eastern side only reached the Sovev. And now Maimonides tells us, V'chalon haita b'maravo shel kevesh, amma al amma, urevuva haita nikretz. Against the western side of the ramp, the main portion of the ramp, there was actually, in the structure of the ramp, he calls it a window, a space, an opening of 1 amma by 1 amma, a square space, in the very side of the ramp. This was called rivuva. Shaba notnin psulei chatat ha'of ad sheta'avor tsurata v'tetzei lebeit hasrefa. This space that we see, this kind of a shelf inside and underneath the top of the ramp itself, accessible through this window on the western side, what was it for? Into that area were placed unfit, blemished offerings that were actually sin offerings from fowl, which became blemished. They were placed there until they began to lose their substance, and at that time, once they were no longer recognizable, they were removed to a place outside the walls of the city called the Beit HaSrefa. This was a place where unfit offerings could be burnt outside of the environs of the temple. What is this really all about? The idea is that, as the commentary on the Mishnah, the Tiferet Israel tells us, there were actually many opportunities for the bringing of sin offerings of fowl, of birds. There was a multitude of these chatat, of offerings that were brought, and there was a suspicion, there was a problem. They didn't want, the Kohanim in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, did not want, because there was such a large amount of chatat min ha'of, of sin offerings from fowl that were being processed. They did not want these to become confused or mixed up with those that may be present that had become blemished, which did happen occasionally, and perhaps often, that some unforeseen or untoward occurrence happened that would render an offering unfit. And so these offerings that were unfit had to be designated in a particular place where they could be kept, and it was necessary to keep them there until they no longer would be called officially, would no longer have the qualifications to be an offering. In other words, the permitted time for their offering would expire, and then they would be able to be taken out to the place where they would be properly disposed of by burning, because of the fact that they have a certain inherent sanctity. This presented a particular halachic dilemma, halachic problem, when they could be disposed of and in what manner, and this is the method in which the Kohanim dealt with the problem of these blemished offerings. And there they remained until the time arrived when they would be permitted to dispose of them, and would no longer be considered to be a dishonoring to the offering, because even though it became unfit, They were not allowed to dispose of it in a mundane way, so therefore it was necessary to keep it there until it was no longer fit to be an offering, and then it would be burnt in the Beit HaSrifa, in the place of burning. Actually, we still have several more halachot in this chapter, so we're going to be coming back to it. We're going to be finishing in the near future this second chapter of Maimonides Hilchot Beit HaBechira, laws dealing with the altar, and again, we see from the very time of year in which we find ourselves, the time of approaching the month of Nisan, the festival of Passover, the time of our redemption, we know that the Torah has an eternal obligation for us to bring the Passover offering, which requires the altar. And so, as this appears to be a leap of faith for us in our generation to give this a practical application, we know that God emphasizes to us through the Torah that the temple will be rebuilt, the offerings will be brought, and the light of the divine presence will return to the world once again, the light to Israel and the light to the nations.